Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, great to have your company. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. Labor again on the back foot when it comes to freed foreign criminals, with new concerns that requirements for monitoring and curfews will soon go. Reports today too that the government is rushing to settle cases out of court to avoid the embarrassment of more legal losses. Senator James Paterson joins me tonight for more. A sigh of relief from mortgage holders today as the Reserve Bank keeps rates on hold. However, with more than 250,000 households set to come off fixed rates soon, we're far from out of the woods. Particularly with more dire news today on the housing front, Ross Greenwood up soon with more. Plus, the inexplicable decision by the Albanese government to exclude the heads of ASIO and ACIS from the National Security Committee. Given the concerns aired just weeks ago regarding Islamist terror, this doesn't stack up. And why is the government holding back listing Iran's Revolutionary Guard as an official terror organisation? All of this rings alarm bells for me. And for all the crowing from the likes of Chris Bowen today about a so-called reduction in your power bills, that promise to cut your bill by $275, that's now officially dead. I'll step you through the numbers because they just don't stack up.
It's certainly nowhere near the $275 reduction we were promised by the Prime Minister before the last election.
With annual bills in Western Sydney up 37% on early 2022, will the Minister admit this promise will never be delivered?
I mean, the Albanese government must take us all for fools if they think that a modest cut in some power bills from the 1st of July will somehow make up for the earlier 27% rises over the past 2 years, especially after the Prime Minister promised no fewer than 100 times that if you elected him, he'd cut your power bill by $275 per household per year.
Households will benefit by $275 on average. Reducing power prices by $275. Prices by $275. $275. $275 a year. $275. $275 a year.
Today, the energy regulator issued what's known as the default market offer, and this was its draft form. In it, the regulator proposed that the basic power price, the so-called default market offer, would drop for some households by between 0.4% and 7.1%, depending where you live. But it would rise for other households by between 0.9% and 2.7%. In other words, if you managed to cut, it would be very small and a long way off cancelling out those power increases of recent times.
Labor's promise of a $275 reduction is dead, gone. And if you look at what Labor had promised and what they will have to pay by next year, in some parts of the country, the difference is up to an additional $1,000.
Here's also a graph put out today by Senator Matt Canavan showing that power prices are up $380 on Labor's watch. And no wonder, because everything the government's doing is driving prices up, not down, or robbing Peter to pay Paul by using taxes out of one pocket to subsidise power bills in the other pocket. Sure, wind and solar, that Labor says will be 82% of our power within 6 years, up from around 25% that we have now, it is relatively cheap. I'll give them that. But only when the wind's blowing and the sun's shining. We, of course, need power 24/7. By the time you throw in gas firming and batteries and everything else needed to keep the lights on when the sun goes down and the wind drops, renewables, well, they are far from cheap. And then there's all the extra transmission lines, at least 10,000 kilometres of them by 2030, that we will need to have to cope with a decentralised grid, all of which we're either paying for now as taxpayers or later as consumers. Indeed, if you consider the fact that transmission costs equate to around 40% of our power bills now, Just wait until all those new lines are built, some $100 billion worth, and that cost is then passed to us on top of what we already now pay in our power bills. Those costs will be huge. Here is O'Brien again.
Today was the moment of truth. This was the moment, because whenever we criticised the government for that promise, they said, wait, we're going to do that in the year 2025. Well, this year, today, we find out what the prices are likely to be in 2025. Yet the government still will not concede that it won't meet that.
But back to the Prime Minister's pre-election promise to cut your bill by $275 a year. Energy Minister Chris Bowen keeps hyperventilating about the effect of the Ukraine war as an excuse for Labor's broken promise. But Labor was still promising to cut your bill by $275 in May 2022, 3 months after the war had started.
Ensuring that renewables are 82% of the system, of the national energy market by 2030, will reduce energy costs by $275. Cheaper electricity bills, $275 a year off your electricity bill.
Look at those dates, long after the Russian tanks rolled over that Ukrainian border. Here's opposition energy spokesman Ted O'Brien again.
Their commitment was by 2025. Yeah. Today we heard the prices by 2025.
For half of the year.
And therefore, what we are looking at is no longer just a broken promise. As of today, this is a deliberate lie.
Today, Labor were hoping that journalists were just dumb enough to regurgitate the line that this offer from the regulator would mean a decrease in power bills from the 1st of July. No surprises. Plenty of journalists this morning fell for it. But again, look at that graph from Senator Canavan. Prices have gone up and up over the first 2 years of this government. If you live in Western Sydney, for example, you've had a 37% increase to your power bills since Labor first were elected, meaning that a single-digit drop, as little as 0.4 for some homes, maybe as much, let's give it to them, maybe as much as 7% for others. Well, that's still a 30% differential on your power bill. You're still paying, even with the drop on the 1st of July, 30% more for your power bill since Labor was elected. Now, there's no $275 cut coming for anyone at all. It's a great big fat lie now from Labor, particularly given what's ahead of us is more renewables, not less, 82%, as I said, by 2030. And Labor is still dead set on all of these targets, even though achieving them is certain to drive prices higher. Now, it might not happen in July, but as soon as all the new wind and solar farms are in and the transmission lines, it all has to be paid for, and that will get passed on to consumers. And here's another problem. Most of the wind turbines and solar panels that this government loves are made in China. So not only is our power becoming more expensive and less reliable, we're increasing our dependency on the communist superpower. Visiting Australia this week, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, well, he must marvel at what we're doing to ourselves, making ourselves poorer and weaker for the sake of futile green gestures. All the while, China's creaming off billions by selling us their solar panels and their wind turbines, as they then open more and more coal-fired power stations to burn Australia's coal. Now, look, I don't suppose, or I hope I don't suppose, that the Albanese government's announcement it was dropping the heads of ASIO and ACIS, our domestic and foreign spy agencies, as routine attendees at the National Security Cabinet meetings, had anything to do with that visit from the Chinese Foreign Minister this week. But he'd have to regard it as a good day's work to get two of the agencies most concerned about the China threat now pushed outside the formal decision-making processes of Cabinet in Canberra. The National Security Committee, we call it the NSC, as the name suggests, is a committee of Cabinet. In formal terms, the members of the NSC are the politicians, not the bureaucrats. The politicians are the formal members. So that's the PM, senior ministers like the Defence Minister, Foreign Minister, and other security portfolios. And there to advise them in the room are the top defence, security and foreign affairs experts that Australia has. Or were there in my time, and perhaps there in Labor's time, but not under this government, not until Labor booted them out. Two of the most important people we have in the ASIO chief, that's the boss in charge of our domestic intelligence, and the ASIS chief, our foreign spy agency. Now, having sat in plenty of these NSC meetings in the past, I find this decision by Prime Minister Albanese very concerning, to say the least. In my time sitting there and dealing with issues like Islamic State, Australian troops in Afghanistan, MH17 being shot down in Ukraine by Russian separatists, the Lindt siege in Sydney, a whole lot more I can't publicly talk about, obviously. Well, I think we always had a better discussion with the spy chiefs in the room, where their advice was contestable, where it could be challenged by others, where questions could be asked, rather than just rely on written briefings before the meeting. Frankly, this decision to show them the door is dumb, particularly given only a couple of weeks ago the ASIO boss said the threat of an Islamist terror attack on Australian soil within the next 12 months was real. And what? The PM doesn't want the bloke charged with keeping us safe to now attend these national security cabinet meetings as a matter of course. It makes no sense, and it should be reversed immediately. All right, let's get the headlines now from Canberra. Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
The National Energy Regulator has published its draft prices, which would come into effect from July 1, which shows the majority of household electricity bills will come down. The price falls of $20 to $50 per year for the average home will only go some of the way to clawing back sky-high electricity price hikes over the past 2 years. And some households could still see a bump on their bill under the proposed pricing. With the next federal election due by May next year, the opposition is stepping up attacks over soaring bills.
The DMO figures indicate that any hope has been snuffed out of Labor delivering on its $275 promise. We say Albo owes you.
The regulator will hand down its final price decision in May. The Reserve Bank of Australia has kept the cash rate on hold at 4.35% as it awaits further evidence the inflation dragon has been tamed. The decision was widely expected by economists and investors and leaves the cash rate at a 12-year high. In good news for mortgage holders, economists are tipping the next rate move to be a cut, although not until September at the earliest.
We do think that we are on the path to get ourselves back to inflation in target within our forecast period.
Anthony Albanese says he won't proceed with changes to religious freedoms, a Labor election promise, if Peter Dutton doesn't offer bipartisan support. The Prime Minister says 2 pieces of legislation have been drafted and that the government has found a balanced position that protects religious liberty, the right of schools to employ and the rights of children. If there is not agreement, then now is not the time to have a divisive debate, especially with the rise in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, Mr Albanese said, according to a caucus spokesperson. Mr Albanese has spoken with the opposition leader, where he's flagged Labor will only proceed with new laws with the coalition's support.
That's the setup here. And the character of the Prime Minister here is completely and utterly in question. How can he say to the religious leaders of our country, as he did to the Indigenous leaders, that he would stand up and that he would fight for their issue on their behalf?
Joining me now, my colleague, Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell. Well, we'll start, if we can, Andrew, the detainee saga back in the spotlight again today. We saw Andrew Giles do his best to deflect blame yesterday in question time, accusing the coalition of refusing to be briefed on the release of these criminal detainees. But you have exclusively revealed that the evidence is there to refute those claims, haven't you?
Well, the opposition wrote to the government after we told Michaelia Cash, the Shadow Attorney General, on Sunday Agenda about this claim from the government that they had refused to see some legal advice which Mark Dreyfus was offering around December, which showed they didn't have to just release one detainee after this High Court decision. Now, infamous NZYQ case last year, they had to release 150. Now, Dan Tehan and Michaelia Cash couldn't make that meeting, and the government said, well, they don't want to see the legal advice. So Michaelia Cash writes today saying, with Dan Tehan, saying, well, how about now? You just show us the legal advice. And government writes back, and so there's letters going back and forth. But what they're seeking to do, the opposition clearly, is to say, well, actually, yeah, we're happy to meet right now, anywhere, anytime. Let's get on with it. So I think that should kill that argument somewhat that the government's been mounting. Obviously, they're trying to deflect. And I think it's an indication of how much the government's concerned about this issue, that you've had Claire O'Neill and Andrew Giles brief journalists, then under pressure give on the record comments to journalists last Friday. Then there's this claim that the opposition had a chance to get legal advice, didn't want to see it. The government, people in government are suggesting to me they don't want to know the truth. That's their view. The opposition's view is you guys are playing as well. It's an unseemly squabble, to be frank, Peter, but what's important and concerning is we've got this High Court case coming next month, a decision next month, and the indications are more detainees will be released with criminal records. And we know some have already re-offended, so it's not good news for the public politically. It's certainly bad news for the government.
Well, I think Labor will be under pressure with the next case. It pertains to about 127 detainees, if I remember the material in the papers this morning. So they'll be under pressure to only release the one or two or three that are the head case applicants, not to panic, as the opposition alleges they did with the previous case, and not just release NZQR, but to go and release the whole 149. Just on your point there, the exchange of letters in relation to this legal advice, has the government now committed, and they're all there in Canberra, has the government committed to show the opposition that legal advice?
I don't know. I'll chase that again tomorrow, not at the time of broadcast, but I would imagine it would happen this week. They've got a couple more days.
All right, talk to me about the politics of power bills. I'm going to get into all the detail of this draft version of the default market offer. It sits on the table for people at home for a number of months and then becomes final in middle of the year. Some postcodes, Andrew, they'll get a small reduction. At best they can get is 7%. Other postcodes, Queensland, regional New South Wales, parts of Western Sydney, they're actually going to get an increase to their power bills. Now, if you look at the last couple of years, and we heard from one of the members in the House today, people in her community, she said, have had almost a 40% increase in their power bills over the last 2 years. 7% is a drop in the ocean, particularly when people were told they were going to get a big whack from the PM, $275, if you got elected, off their bills. How's this going to play out?
Well, the opposition needs to take their chance here. They need to prosecute this long and loud. And really, the amount of pressure that comes to bear will be dependent on the opposition's performance. Now, Peter Dutton told his party room today, we're still in this, even though this is the first party room since Dunkley, the by-election loss, remember? And he said, we're still in this, we could still win this election. They haven't got the answers of cost of living, and they haven't got the answers on energy costs. And that's obviously where he's going to concentrate. And you can see why when you take this electricity bill example, because electricity bills have gone up about $830 a year, and now they're flattening out, right? They're still up $830 a year, and you're going to cop the bill every year. So how much is the tax reduction, tax cut change worth to those on low to middle incomes? Well, it's worth about $1,000 a year, isn't it? So it's really already been paid for in terms of the electricity bill rises. Now, that's the line the opposition should be running. Far be it from me to give them advice, but that's my advice, Peter.
I'll dispute they're going to flatten out too, because once we put all the renewable transmission costs in, and renewables are transmission costs are about 40% of our power bills as they stand, I think there's going to be a bit like this, and then it's going to be exponential before we get to 2030. Hey, just quickly, what can you tell us about this religious discrimination bill? You're all over that one as well.
Yes, well, there was a conversation between Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton on the plane back from Jack Fitzgibbon's funeral, where Anthony Albanese said, I need bipartisan support and we're not doing anything. And that's before they even get to the start line with the bill. So Mickey Cash was on Sunday Agenda saying, oh, look, they're going to have this report down on Thursday saying what they're doing on religious discrimination, or at least a recommendation from the Law Reform Commission about what they're going to do. But it just seems to me they want to kick the can down the road, and that's what Anthony Albanese told caucus. If we can't get bipartisan support, and he actually quoted Mickey Cash's comments, we can't really go ahead with this one. I don't think the government, even though they promised to advance this, really want to. They don't want to in terms of the febrile environment in the community at the moment around Israel and Palestine, but also you saw how politically tough it was for Scott Morrison. Everyone complains no matter what change you make. But it's an interesting tactic, isn't it? He's almost saying, I'm going to blame the opposition to his caucus for not pressing ahead with this. Now, I compared this to aged care reform because I felt there was a similar approach today on that. They said we need bipartisan support or we're not pressing ahead with that. I am told, though, that they are a bit more determined on that front. So I think they're going to try harder with the opposition on that one, and you'd hope so given the cost of aged care in this country.
Look, I remember all the school wars, particularly with Catholic schools and low-fee independent schools, not the rich schools, but the modest schools. I think that's also probably spooked them as well. That's all back from the Howard years there, but it burnt them hard in some seats. Thank you, Andrew. Let's go now to some other issues. Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neil already conceding late last week that Labor's lost control of the detainee situation involving hundreds of foreign criminals. And we learned today the measures the government's put in place, allegedly, to keep us safe, the ankle bracelets, curfews and so on, now all face legal challenges, meaning the courts could order the government to scrap them. And if that happens, no one in Labor seems willing to tell us what their plan B is to keep Australians safe. For more, I'm joined now by Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, James Paterson. Senator, thank you for your time. A barrister working for the detainees says that the Commonwealth has covertly, so secretly, settled at least 3 High Court challenges to the mandatory monitoring. He says to avoid the embarrassment of losing these cases and further headlines. But without monitoring, James, and if it comes to this, let's say the other things, the ankle bracelets and everything else has to go off all detainees, what's the government going to do then to keep us safe? What's their plan B?
Peter, I had a sneaking suspicion that this was the case, and last month I put it to the Department of Home Affairs in Senate estimates, and they were horrified by the accusation that they might be taking ankle bracelets off applicants because their lawyers happened to be bringing cases to the court to argue the validity of doing so. They said they would never do something like that. But I think this barrister might be onto something. I don't think it's a coincidence that the people who brought cases have also been the ones who've been let off from their obligations under the scheme, which you might remember the Immigration Minister Andrew Giles said would apply to virtually every one of those 149 released detainees. Like you, I'm deeply concerned about these upcoming High Court cases, because if these applicants are successful, arguing on the basis that they've failed to cooperate with their removal and therefore are being indefinitely detained, that is effectively the end of immigration detention in Australia. It will effectively be impossible for the Australian government to detain anyone, even if they have breached the law, even if they have no right to be here, and it will bring to an end a key pillar of our immigration system, our border protection system. And the most alarming thing about this, Peter, is that the government seems to be throwing their hands up in the air, saying this is out of our hands, it's with the court, there's nothing we can do. And that sends a shocking signal to people smugglers who will be using this weakness from the Albanese government to exploit and to get people to get back on boats again.
Yeah, but honestly, James, you and I know. I mean, if they've got legal ambiguity about the ability of law enforcement agencies via the government to put these bracelets on and keep these bracelets on, if they're fear of losing court challenges, the Parliament's sitting right now. They can remediate these definitions. They can also deal with the risk of another 127 that are currently before the High Court. And this cohort, I might add, Iran, Iraq, Sudanese people are involved here. I mean, that's not a trifecta of good countries. This is what disturbs me. Why can't the government, while Parliament is sitting, fix this mess?
Peter, that's spot on. The Parliament is sitting now. It has sat for weeks already this year. There are 2 problems we could help the government solve if they exist. One is tightening up the legislation around ankle bracelets and other monitoring to make sure it is legally robust. If there are changes necessary, we will support them. The other thing we can do is help assist the government to make some applications for preventive detention orders, which they say the Parliament has set the bar too high, and that's why they haven't been able to make applications. Well, on behalf of the opposition, I offer the government any support they need to fix those issues, to get these dangerous people off the streets so the community is safe. It is now 4 months since we rushed those preventive detention orders through the Parliament, and not one application has been made for the 7 murderers, the 37 sex offenders, or the other dozens of violent offenders that are out there in the community and are re-offending regularly against Australians.
Talk to me about the government. They had a recommendation to list Iran's Revolutionary Guard as a terror group, but they're now backflipping, I'm told, because they regard this Revolutionary Guard as an organ of a nation state. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, James, but they're listed as a terror group in the United States. Why on earth aren't we listing them here?
You're right, Peter, and this has been outstanding work by my colleague Senator Claire Chandler to point this out. It looks like the government started and went through a terrorism listing process for the IRGC. They stopped it at some point for an unknown reason and have offered no adequate explanation for why that's the case. I mean, let's remember that the IRGC is the principal state sponsor of terrorism across the Middle East. Some of its proxies include Hamas and Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Shia militant groups in Iraq and Syria, who are right now launching attacks on American bases and troops in the region, the Houthis in Yemen. This is a very bad actor, and we should stand with our allies and our friends by listing them as a terrorist organisation, but this government is too weak to do so yet again.
All right, I've sat in National Security Cabinet as an advisor, obviously, but I've watched evidence from ASIO and ASIS chiefs in that room. I've seen it turn the room, and I've seen them contest evidence or advice or briefings from other senior people around the table. Perhaps in some instances they've been military, other times they've been foreign service or politicians. To take them out of the room, James, I think is extraordinary. I think this is a big call. They've been in the room under Labor governments in the past and certainly under coalition governments. This is a concerning move. What's behind it?
You're right, Peter, and this was an extraordinary scoop by your colleague Sharri Markson last night. I mean, no wonder the Albanese government has been so weak on national security. No wonder they've made so many poor decisions. They haven't had the key people in the room to provide them with the advice that they need, and maybe some of the advice that they don't want to hear, and maybe that's why they've been removed from the room. But I want to reassure your viewers, Peter, it's not all bad news, because the Director Generals of ASIO and ASIS have been replaced on the committee by the Minister for Energy and Climate Change, Chris Bowen. Now, Chris Bowen obviously has much more insight to share on national security and intelligence than the heads of our intelligence agencies, who are involved day to day in collecting intelligence both offshore and onshore against the terrorism, foreign interference and espionage threats that our country faces.
Yeah, you know, comedian there, and it gives me no comfort to have Chris Bowen in the room. You and I know how much you can deal with the other side on issues like this, James, quietly behind closed doors and get them to back down when they made a dumb decision. I think this is a dumb decision. Are you hopeful you can have a word to Labor senior ministers, perhaps even the Prime Minister, and get them to rethink this move? I mean, we just only had that advice from Mike Burgess, the ASIO chief, for people at home, saying, you know, he is concerned about Islamist terror attacks in Australia over the next 12 months. So when this committee meets, he is not there keeping the room up to date, keeping the Prime Minister up to date about Australia's security. Surely they can back down here.
I really hope so, Peter. I hope sense prevails, but I'm concerned because it's my understanding this decision was made some time ago. It was not a recent decision, and for much of the past year or so, these meetings have been taking place without those agencies being represented in the room. And as you said before, you can't always anticipate when they've got a contribution of value to make. And if you don't regularly have them in the room, if they're only invited occasionally, you're missing out on the insight that they and all the thousands of patriotic members of the intelligence community are working hard to provide. I mean, what is the point of having intelligence agencies, funding them and giving them powers to provide advice and insight to government if you are not there to hear it at the critical point in which you're making decisions in the national interest? So I hope the Prime Minister is embarrassed by these revelations. I hope he revisits the decision that he has clearly made to kick these intelligence agency chiefs off the NSC, and I hope he quickly reverses it, but I'm not holding my breath.
Well, I think he'd be a big fan if he did. I think it's the right thing to do to reverse it. Thank you, James Paterson. All right, after the break, Ross Greenwood, his take today on that rates decision. And will we see a reduction in the future? I know that's what a lot of people are hanging on for. And bad news in terms of housing supply, immigration far outpacing the government's ambitions for over 1 million new homes. Looks like another pipe dream. Welcome back. Labor's great power bill lie. Today's so-called price decrease, if you even get it, is a drop in the ocean compared to what you were paying just 2 years ago. And wait until those skyrocketing transmission costs start to get added in. More on that shortly, but we'll go now to the RBA decision to keep the cash rate on hold, 4.35% today. Joining me now, Sky's business editor, Ross Greenwood. Well, no surprise today, Ross, based on what you've seen and heard and all the analysts running around shooting out their little updates to business. There was some talk about a rate reprieve ahead for us in August and September. Give us your sense of what everyone's thinking is on the money.
I would suggest that most are now saying it's probably later, although the key thing that happened today was that the Reserve Bank changed its bias. It had previously said it would not rule out further interest rate rises. Well, that's gone, and the Reserve Bank says it rules nothing in or out. And Michelle Bullock extrapolated on that at the media conference she held afterwards, which has become really instructive, to be honest, and gives you more detail in terms of where the Reserve Bank is thinking. And effectively, you get this notion that the Reserve Bank is really waiting to see what plays out in Australia's economy, what happens to this inflation rate. If it falls faster and if the unemployment rate rises more quickly than they anticipate, there's no doubt the interest rate rises will come sooner rather than later. But if the inflation, in particular as a result of wage rises, really is a little bit more sticky than what they would have anticipated, then it's more likely that the first rate cut won't come until late this year, the very late, probably November or even into next year. And so really right now the Reserve Bank is saying it's sitting on its hands waiting to see that data, to see what plays out, to see what pressures come from the wage claims going through Australia's economy right now, to see what other forms of inflation just might turn up in that period of time.
Was there anything else that struck you in the media conference today?
Yeah, really, it was almost a pretty straight up front approach from Michelle Bullock. One thing she did say was that, say, for example, healthcare workers getting a wage rise, she indicated, well, it's not really going to change our forecast terribly much. And the reality is that, she says they were probably underpaid, so in many ways that's welcomed. But the one thing that the Reserve Bank won't be able to cop with inflation is if there is an expected increase in wages that drives inflation higher. That's homegrown inflation. And so this is the reason why they have we won't rule it in, we won't rule it out. Because as she says, really, you can't suddenly start to go through a wave of cutting interest rates. If that then fuels inflation, which means you then have to turn it around and start to raise rates again. You want to know by the time that you're going to make the decision to start cutting interest rates that you really are on top of the economy, that inflation has started to come down. Probably there will be more unemployment by that time as well. It will have risen more. And remember now the Reserve Bank has got a mandate to not just look at inflation, but also the employment rate. So these things become pretty crucial in terms of where they tend to go through. So these are the key stats you got. You got the cash rate at 4.35%. Inflation now underneath that, but it needs to go lower again. And wages growth at 4.2%. So these are the key numbers the Reserve Bank is looking at right now.
All right, talk to me about those stats out today. There were two that struck me, particularly in New South Wales and Sydney. You've got a large number of people, close to a majority, paying basically half their income on their mortgage. But then the reality of people coming off these fixed term mortgages, about 250,000 of us over the next few months, meaning they could be on a 2% mortgage. It could well go to 4 or 4 plus, maybe 5 even. If they're already doing it that tough, how on earth do you double that mortgage repayment?
I'll tell you what, that's the hardest part for many families in Australia right now, coming off fixed rate mortgages, because what you've also got is real pressure. You've got rising tax take from the government. Bracket creep has meant that more Australians have been pushed into higher tax brackets and a bigger proportion of their wage. It's almost like the hidden sort of, if you like, bite in family budgets. Everybody talks about interest rates. Everybody talks about grocery prices. Nobody actually talks about the take of the government in regards to tax. But then on top of that, you've got energy bills that you've talked about already. But if you go and have a look at the Australian Energy Regulator that put out that draft determination today, effectively yesterday it put out a second piece of information that said the best part of 130,000 Australian families right now are in energy bill stress, and that they're on plans with their energy provider to try and overcome the problems that they simply can't pay their bills. Those people on such plans have basically got energy bills they can't pay of around $2,000 on average. So really, if you see that, plus the rental crisis, plus the mortgage crisis, plus the lack of home building, this situation is not going to be solved anytime soon by the government. It really requires a significant change in Australia's economy before you start to get more homes being built in this country.
Well, just before we go, let's stay on homes then, because the target's supposed to be 1.2 million homes by mid-2029, so, not that far away. The reports are that we're lucky to get to 80,000 new homes in that time. Now, 80,000 new homes in that time frame, when you consider, 700,000 people arriving in Australia, yes, they might bring down some of that migration over time, but you've still got a lot of migration that comes by way of visitors and students. They can't control that. And of course, they all need somewhere to live, even if they're not here permanently. How on earth do you square this circle?
Well, you don't. That's the problem right now. And it's the reason why home prices keep getting squeezed ever higher, simply because rents are rising, which gives the attraction for investors to go and buy. The builders are not building because they can't make money when they build, and builders right now are going broke, so there's not enough builders out there. And also what you need to build 1.2 million homes out to 2029 is $1 trillion on today's prices. Who puts in the $1 trillion? Normally it would be developers selling out to new home buyers, but right now the builders aren't building. So where does that $1 trillion come from? It's not coming from the federal government, I can tell you. They don't have that sort of cash. So it's got to come from investors somewhere who've got to have an incentive to put that money in terms of the profits they will make. That incentive is not there right now because home prices have got so high, it's impossible to buy the land required to go out and build these homes. And so, as I say, it's a vicious circle that is not going to be fixed anytime soon unless you have fundamental change at local councils, at state governments, and also at the federal government coordinating to get more land released and more homes built.
Well, they're all basically Labor governments now. The Prime Minister, if he has some bottle, could get it sorted out. Ross Greenwood, thank you.
Correct.
All right, after the break, that spin from Bowen trying to sell a very modest decrease in power prices is a big win for you. You know it's not. I know it's not. We'll get into that after the break. And the $275 cut to your power bills, the big election promise, it's now officially dead, says the opposition. Welcome back. Despite the fact that power prices have risen by up to 40% in just 2 years, Chris Bowen wants you to believe that today's draft default market offer is a win. It's anything but. At best, people will see a price drop of 7%, depending on where they live, with some households told to expect a rise, yes, an increase in the power bills of just under 3%. Now, I get it. During a cost of living crisis, you're going to take whatever win you can get. But when Labor went to the election promising you your bill would be down by $275 a year, the reality is it's gone up between $250 a year and for some nearly $830. That's of course before we factor in those heavy increases in the way of transmission costs for renewables, which will come thick and fast. Joining me now to get our heads around all the detail here, Environment Editor at The Australian, Graham Lloyd. Well, when you break it down, given what sort of price increases we've copped over the last 2 years, at best, you're going to get 7% in terms of a drop. A lot of people won't get anywhere near that, Graham. I think 0.9% was sort of down where most people can expect. For some people, some households, their bills are actually going to increase. Is this what people thought they were getting?
Well, good evening, Peter. It's certainly given the government something to attempt to hang its hat on, but it's not as clear as it appears. On face value, you would say that this is going to represent lower electricity bills for some households between sort of $20 to $50 a year. But the default offer isn't the price that everybody pays. It's a cap, if you like, that's recommended by the regulator, and about 50% of households are on offers that are less than that. And what we're seeing in the energy market is a squeeze on competition, and that's reflected in this report. So the reality is that we will probably see people having their electricity bills squeezed up towards this default price. So they won't be feeling any reductions there.
The opposition today said that Labor's $275 cut to your power bills promised at the election, that's officially dead. I know they've liked to blame it disappearing on the Ukraine war. I showed some footage at the top of the show, the Prime Minister making that promise long after the Ukraine war had begun. Do you think it's dead as well?
I think it's a Herculean task to think that it can be achieved because all the indicators are running in the other direction. The sort of saving of 275 was really something that was picked out of modelling from nowhere. The reality on the ground in terms of sort of transforming the electricity sector isn't going anywhere near as planned according to that modelling. So no, I don't think that will be delivered. The challenge is still on to keep the system together.
I guess the worry for me when you look at this is what we know is coming over the horizon. So now we're about 25% renewables. We're headed for 82% renewables in just 6 years. When we get to 82% renewables, Graham, we're going to have wind farms and solar farms as far as the eye can see, and we've got to get that power they're generating to market, to homes, to consumers. That means all these transmission lines, $100 billion worth of transmission lines. When you consider right now that the transmission cost is 40% of our power bill, if we go out and spend $100 billion, that's got to be paid for. That's going to get into our power bills as well. And that's when they're going to go like this, isn't it?
Well, that's right. I think there was an extraordinary sort of figure there at 40% of the cost is in the transmission infrastructure. And we know that is where a great deal of money has to be spent. They're regulated assets. They'll get a return on investment, and that has to come from power users or taxpayers. And the other thing is the system that Mr. Bowen is putting in place to underwrite the profitability of these renewable energy projects. It's really unknown how that is going to play out. And if we build a lot of projects and they're only required to run at certain times, will they be paid for the times they're not allowed to run? This is an issue that is causing a great deal of financial pain in the UK at the moment, and it's something that needs to be carefully watched.
You're right to remind you, he hasn't put that modelling out. He's keeping the detail there commercially in confidence, he says, or well, let's call that secret. And we also know that there's billions of dollars on the table too for coal generation, to keep coal-fired power going so we can keep the lights on. Goodness me, what a mess. Graham Lloyd, thank you. All right, after the break, Donald Trump has revealed he won't be able to post his bond in the New York civil case that's coming up. So what does it mean for his White House bid? I'll have more on that shortly. Plus that attack on Margaret Thatcher from inside a key British institution up next. Welcome back. Lots of international things to get into. Of course, that news there about Trump and that bond. Dicey for the White House. Let's bring in my Sky News contributor, Kosha Garda, former Labor MP to Michael Danby. Michael, I want to start with you. My audience will be really familiar with the ASPI experts we have on this show. It's an Australian Strategic Policy Institute. I think, set up in the Howard era, but certainly supported by both sides of government, and really serious senior politicians are often appointed onto its board. I am concerned, we've just gone through this removal of our spy chiefs from the National Security Committee of Cabinet. I am concerned now to hear that Labor's ordered this big review into ASPI. We know that the Chinese can't bear ASPI. It looks to me like a review you have when you want to shut them down. Am I wrong?
Oh, Peter, I'm worried that it's called Investigation into the Strategic Policy Work. And it sounds very much like a Yes Minister attempt to defund ASPI. That would be terrible, and it would be further evidence of the government's blindness to criticism of China. Remember, with the downgrading of ASIO, ASIO had just previously warned about foreign interference, i.e. China's effect in Australia. So Glyn Davis, the person who was described on Sharry's program the other night, is the head of Albo's office, and I'm worried that he's assuming the role that Sir Horace Wilson did for Neville Chamberlain, but over China policy, not over policy towards Germany.
Defang us, basically. That's what it is, isn't it?
No Pizzullo, no ASIO.
Calamity of errors in immigration, taking out the NSC, as of the ASIS boss and the ASIO boss from NSC, all of that I think is incredibly concerning. Talk to me about this issue with the bond and Donald Trump. I mean, you don't find $400 million down the back of the couch, but I mean, if he hasn't got that bond to post, this is the New York civil case, what's going to happen from here on in? How's it play out?
It's really quite perverse. So from a legal perspective, he is appealing that. It'll probably be on the basis of the 8th Amendment, which says you cannot have excessive bail or inflict cruel and unusual punishment on people. So it'll go up to that. This will look very disproportional to what the conviction is about and what others in the same jurisdiction had been subject to. However, that takes time as it runs its way up the court system. And so he has to post this bond. If he's unable to, because he doesn't have that kind of liquidity, then they will seize his assets, potentially. That's the legal side.
Wow.
The political side is, this just looks more and more outrageous. They're doing the unthinkable, which is he's a very unlikable figure to many people, but they're making him empathetic. And just as context, I'll leave you with this and your viewers with this, that O.J. Simpson, who was also convicted famously in the civil case, he wasn't found guilty in the criminal case, his judgment was $33 million, which in today's terms is $66 million for murdering 2 human beings. And here we're looking at $450+ million for a crime that there were no victims in, because the banks were not even the plaintiffs. It was the state of New York. So the whole thing reeks to a lot of people, including to Trump haters. It's not a good look.
What's happening with Biden and Netanyahu, their relationship, the dynamic over this Rafah issue?
Well, Biden's backed Chuck Schumer, who made a speech in the US Senate basically saying that there should be regime change in Israel. Netanyahu's shot back saying, we're a sovereign country, we're not a banana republic, we're going to destroy the last 4 battalions of bitter enders in Rafah. Now, the Israelis have a responsibility to make sure that the Palestinian civilians in that area are shifted out to the beach area and housed properly and fed properly. But we wouldn't have said to General Montgomery or Eisenhower that we can't go to Berlin, we've got halfway across Germany, we ought to stop now. So they're a sovereign country, they'll make their own decisions. I'm not a fan of Netanyahu. Gantz, the leader of the opposition, has said that there should be a decision made by the Israelis, not in the American Senate.
What are we seeing in the Portuguese election that seems to be playing out right across Europe? This is really interesting.
It is interesting. I think it's the battle line of the last half century, these liberal democracies, or Western democracies, I should say. You've got sort of the right, centre-right party has taken, or the coalition has come into power after a long time, but ascendant in that is this populist group that has gained seats substantially. You see the same trend in Sweden and Finland and the Netherlands, even in Germany and France with Marine Le Pen and all of that. They're ascendant, either winning outright or gaining a big share. And that is because of all the reasons we know. I think the immigration is the biggest fault line over here, changing the demographics of these countries. The rural part of the electorate is feeling disenfranchised. And as you see that momentum, it's sort of a counterweight to the leftward drift of these countries. They're gaining a bigger share of the EU as well, and they're going to have more influence on policy that comes out of that. And I think you're just going to see more of that shift and that battle line. sharpening.
Just quickly, Michael, I mean, the rise of, I guess, the right more broadly across Europe, I think is shaking people up, particularly when you look at what's happened with Ukraine and a steeliness coming out of Europe.
A lot of the far right are funded by Putin. Mrs. Le Pen's party got a huge €35 million loan from Putin, which hasn't been repaid, I've noted. But I'm not as down on Europe as other people are. 20 of the 32 countries are now on 2%. Poland's got more tanks than a dozen countries in Europe, and 3%. The Czechs are collecting 1,155mm shells all over the world for the Ukrainians. So I think the Ukrainians, with European help, will be able to defend themselves, even if the Americans and Trump cut them loose.
I think most of it who's been to London, we know the V&A, the Victorian Albert Museum, but they've gone after Thatcher, and this has caused a huge ruckus in London.
It has. I think when everybody's racist and villainous, then nobody's racist and villainous. So they're just throwing everybody in there. They're lumping her in with Osama bin Laden and Hitler, which is bizarre. And the thing with comedy is it has to be an equal opportunity offender. When it's always in one direction, criticizing heroes of one side, it's no longer funny and it's a lost art form.
It's not funny at all. Princess Kate, we saw a glimmer of her. I think we've got some vision there on the screen. We saw a glimmer of her out today, putting paid to this idea that she's in a hospital bed, on coma or on life support, and all the sort of conspiracy theories that run around. I feel for her when she eventually comes back into the public square, Michael. She's going to be hounded, isn't she?
She is, and I like a lot of commentators on this network, I can't understand the huge offence that people were caused by her presenting of that photo. I mean, she did a bit of editing.
What person at the age of 40 doesn't edit a photograph? Anyway, I've got to leave it there. Andrew Bolt's up next. That's it for me. See you tomorrow night at 6. Here's Andrew.